I am. I'm stunned. Convoke it.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! See that guy right there? Looks like he's hit rock bottom. Well, that guy is BlizzCon champion Venruki, believe it or not. Now, I bet you're wondering how he got into this situation. It all started at MLG Orlando 2009.
Wow, and down goes Venruki.
Hopefully that never becomes a meme. I bet you found yourself checking your death log a lot this season. Even when it takes you 5 or 0.5 seconds to die, Shadowlands damage seems a bit insane. But why is this? Was it always like this? How did we get here? And more importantly, what does this mean for the future of PvP? Sit back because we're going to take a deep dive into the history of WoW Arena, including some vintage clips. And we're going to see how just a few changes over the past decade have created the meta we have today in Shadowlands Season 2. Anyone who's ever played World of Warcraft knows the rush of seeing big numbers on your screen. And since the dawn of PvP, WoW players have been using spell modifiers to see bigger and bigger numbers. Even in classic WoW, where only a few classes actually had cooldowns and the concept of conduit energy still would not have made sense at the time, people found ways to modify their spells to do more damage. Whether this was with the Berserker buff in Warsong Gulch, world buffs, or potions, players were already thirsting for bigger numbers on their screen. Sensing a need to tone back on the complete chaos of early PvP, a stat called Resilience was implemented in TBC to tone down the most basic and fundamental damage multiplier, Critical Strike. Resilience gave a flat damage reduction to any critical strike attack. With no resilience, your character was completely worthless in Arena. On the flip side, some classes could stack resilience, turning their characters into actual raid bosses. Now, I want you to keep this in mind because the power of critical strikes and the ability to minimize their damage will be changed dramatically over WoW's timeline, and understanding this will help answer the question of how we got to Shadowlands damage. Wrath of the Lich King would push critical strikes to their absolute limit, as classes started gaining more stats, gem sockets, enchants, broken trinkets, OP weapons, and of course, offensive cooldowns, which would turn the dial up dramatically on critical strike damage. For some people, even though damage was insane, Wrath remains iconic in design. Its chaos was poetic in a way, its pacing was pristine, and many of those who lived it eventually went back and are still there to this day. But as Wrath of the Lich King drew to its end, some things were about to change.
The proud defenders of Azeroth fight to secure a lasting peace. But there can be no peace when the world itself is devoured by rage.
The game would fundamentally change in Cataclysm. I will tell you why, and it's probably something you weren't expecting. Damage was still high in Cata, and some comps could still kill your character in a few globals. But what was truly brewing in Ring of Valor was the strength of defense, and for the first time in WoW's history, it became as strong and perhaps even stronger than offense, and this trend would continue across every expansion. Don't believe me? The entire BlizzCon Finals from Wrath of the Lich King in 2009 fits in a 10-minute VOD, which is a massive contrast to 2016, where the Grand Finals took over 2 whole hours. What started in Cataclysm was an arms race. As the factions of Azeroth were growing, there were 2 factions brewing in Arena, with offensive and defensive abilities starting to fight for dominance. And as players grew better at surviving and healers became more efficient at healing, games gradually lasted longer and longer until there was no choice but to press the emergency button. And in one of the last patches of Mists of Pandaria, our dear child Dampening was born. Hey, there's Venruki again. He was that guy we showed in the intro, and he is about to win the most important arena game of his life. His team will win this game without even landing a kill. This is the final match of the Arena World Championship in 2012. Before Dampening was in the game, there was a rule which said that if neither team wins by the 20-minute mark in tournament, the winner would be determined by whoever did more damage. And this exact same rule is what caused Venruki to lose the BlizzCon title 2 years prior, when his team lost a game on match point despite landing a kill on the enemy Warlock. This obscure rule single-handedly gave the biggest victory of the year to Europe, which was a bit controversial at the time to say the least. But in 2012, Venruki would get his sweet revenge, and his team would defeat EU with the same 20-minute timeout rule. It was clear that there was a shift in how the game was being played competitively. The game was almost a decade old, and players were getting better and better every expansion, and one consequence of this was a shift towards defense. Once players learned how to play defensive, they could be unkillable in Arena. It would take a 20-minute time limit, and then eventually a stacking healing debuff to end games at the highest level. Warlords of Draenor would be revealed at the Ace Theater in Los Angeles on August 14th of 2013. On stage, 2 developers would be interviewed. One of them was a familiar face to PvP. That, of course, is game designer Brian Holinka. Everyone was eager to play this new expansion. And as it would turn out, the last patch of Mists of Pandaria would wind up being the longest single content patch of all time. This new game seemed to have some really cool features. Despite the memes around Ashran, Warlords of Draenor had some very memorable changes, but there was one change that very few people remember, one that is so obscure that you have to use a time machine in order to find it. Remember when I said that critical strike damage is key to understanding Shadowlands PvP? In Warlords of Draenor, 2 important things would happen. Resilience would be removed and critical strikes would be nerfed. Taking the place of resilience was this new stat called versatility, which obviously still exists today, but with a baseline nerf to critical strike, everyone was dealing less damage. In the battle of offense versus defense, this seemed like an obvious win for defensives, and despite some confusing experimentation with damage scaling in future expansions, one thing was clear: defense was definitely winning. Games were getting longer, especially at the highest level. New defensives would be added for every class, sometimes in the form of a passive defense or in the form of an active ability. On top of that, there were new power-ups available to your character that you could borrow from the outside world. In Legion, they were called artifacts. In BFA, it was Azerite traits and essences, and then eventually corruption. I'm sure you remember that. And at this point in the game's history, we had come a long way since the days of crit montages in vanilla. Whether it was gems, glyphs, honor talents, artifact weapons, or Azerite traits, players were getting more and more tools to make themselves harder to kill. Shadowlands would be no different, but this time it would be covenants adding to player power. But looming in the background, hidden in the game's files, was one change that would separate Shadowlands Arena from nearly a decade of defensive dominance in PvP. It was a change so confusing that it would ignite a series of forum posts and Reddit threads as players started to learn about their new master. And it wouldn't be until 9.1 that offense would become their new king. Shadowlands had taken PvP into a new era marked by unhealable damage, where players found themselves dying like they had never died before. Ret Paladins became the oppressors of Season 1 because they were just good at killing people. Warriors and mages would emerge as the best classes in the game, but not because they were good at dealing damage, but because they were the best at stopping it. In Season 2, monks would take the throne from Ret Paladins in a flurry of blood and steel, as players frantically checked their details logs and saw lines of spinning crane kicks. But if you made a level 60 monk right now and pressed this ability on a target dummy, you would be confused, almost no damage at all. So how does this worthless spell turn into a brutal killing machine? Oh, well, let me open my spellbook. Spinning Crane Kick deals 1,793 damage, but wait, for every target I attack, it hits for 15% more, and this can be even higher with the calculated strikes conduit, and if I pop Storm, Earth, and Fire, I will deal 35% increased damage, right? Wait, no, it will be even higher because of the coordinated offensive conduit. And I completely forgot about Mastery, that will buff my damage too, and if I select this talent, I can get a proc, making it hit twice as hard. Finally understanding the game! Maybe I can multi-class. I heard mages are good. I know about Combustion, that's my main cooldown, right? Oh, and when I use it, it will automatically drop Rune of Power, giving me 40% more damage. That's pretty good. And if I press Fire Blast twice, I will hit even harder. And then with this other conduit, my Pyroblast will be even stronger. And what if I want to play this legendary? This looks fun. I heard rogues are good too. They can one-shot people. I've seen it in clips. I need to Shadow Dance, right? Well, this talent looks important then. 30% more damage. Sweet. I can't forget about Shadow Blades either. 50% more. And when my targets are stunned, I'll hit them even harder with Prey on the Weak. I don't see many people playing this one, but it looks good too if I'm trying to one-shot. And what is that legendary all the rogues use? Oh yeah, this one. Wait a second, I forgot something. What happens to my damage when I crit? Hey, that's Venruki again. He's talking to lead PvP designer Brian Holinka. We've seen him before. This was almost a month before 9.1, and even though we didn't know it at the time, this conversation would tell us everything we needed to know about this new patch.
Ultimately, though, people got to die, and you have to make clips of you one-shotting somebody.
You have to, yeah.
So, and the game generally feels more exciting when there are big hits.
Holinka said people gotta die, and he's right. That is what makes Arena fun. But again, something feels different this season. What could it be? Remember 2 minutes ago we said there was one hidden change in Shadowlands that caused massive forum posts and Reddit arguments? It all had to deal with Critical Strike. And even though the title of this post from the beta was wrong, Critical Strike would still get buffed in Shadowlands. Remember when we were talking about WoD? Crits got nerfed from 200% damage all the way down to 150%. This means instead of dealing 2 times the damage, they were only dealing 1.5. But in Shadowlands, crits in PvP would deal 175% damage. This doesn't seem like that big of a change, but think about it for a second. A spell like Spinning Crane Kick gets 90% increased damage after you attack 6 targets, and then roughly 16% more with calculated strikes. Then when you use Storm, Earth, and Fire, you are dealing 35% more damage, which I think gets buffed to around 40% with the Coordinated Offensive Conduit. And then with full gear, you can get 22% baseline mastery. Combine that with a 200% damage increase with Dance of Chi-Ji, you can start to see a problem. There are just so many things adding to the damage of a single spell. So when that spell crits, it's now going to deal 175% increased damage. That's going to change it quite a bit. But this isn't just a problem with monks. As a Resto Druid, my regrowth can heal for as little as 4k, but when I stack enough modifiers, it can hit for over 100k. That is 25 times the amount of healing. Shadowlands seems to involve a bit too much math. Depending on how many multipliers you have, a spell can hit for way more than its baseline damage. Compare that to earlier expansions, where spells had a much smaller range of how hard they could hit. Even in Wrath, when damage was at its highest, numbers were more predictable. Oh, and by the way, armor is bugged in Season 2. Wait, what? As it turns out, everyone's armor got nerfed in 9.1. It's kind of confusing and involves something called a K value, and it's due to mythic dungeons. Anyway, there's an entire Rex Troy video on it, and the main thing you need to know is that armor gets nerfed every season, so dungeons become harder. And because armor is your primary defense against physical attacks, there is a reason why an armor nerf would be a big problem. It's just another damage modifier to add to the pile. Is Season 2 doomed? For some people, it certainly seems like it, but honestly, what could be done at this point? I mean, damage has to have a limit, right? We can't all be unstoppable forces. People would just start playing Night Fae Paladin just because it has a damage modifier. If they would, they wouldn't use its new Covenant legendary, right? That would be ridiculous. If they would, that would give their partner an 80% chance to deal 60% more damage. No one would possibly play that, right? So why is Shadowlands different? It's sometimes easy to point to one class and say, oh, of course that's broken, but what if it's just the game itself? There are just so many things modifying each spell that it can become confusing to know why you died or why you aren't doing any damage. With the change to critical strikes and a nerf to armor, it feels like we're just adding to a house of cards, and what happens when something goes wrong? And of course, damage multipliers have been in the game forever. Now there are just so many of them that it can be hard to keep track of what's going on. Even in Cataclysm, where the game started to shift towards defense, damage was still high, but it was clear where that damage was coming from. Even without cooldowns, you could still be threatening. Now it's much harder to know where damage is coming from. It's never just a cooldown, it's a million different things, and just looking at your spellbook won't tell you anything useful. Before we finish, we want to make something very clear. The changes in game design over the past decade have happened with vastly different velocities. There have been some really good changes to the game, and I think it's worth acknowledging the contributions Brian Holinka and Chris Kalecki made to PvP. What we're experiencing now is whiplash. We became so used to defense as defining the meta that we are still adjusting to this new offensive speed. Over the course of the game, players have either been unstoppable forces or immovable objects. In Shadowlands, they're both. Sometimes it doesn't matter if you have a 40,000 fleshcraft shield or if you have all your defensives ready. Damage multipliers are just math, and they have turned the game into a battle of multiplication. Who will win? Your math or theirs? Of course, there are changes that probably should be made, but we have to be careful because one small change can have massive consequences. Do we want players to die quickly or never die at all? Thanks for watching this video, guys. It's obviously a bit different than what we normally do, but let us know what you thought in the comments below. And of course, we appreciate your help, so give us a thumbs up if you liked the video and subscribe if you want to see more.